Hello everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the 2016 AANAPISI Grant Competition. My name is Pearson Owens. I'm with the Office of Post-Secondary Education. I have Jonathan Jacobson from the Institute of Education Sciences, who will be going over the evidence portion of the application. So the table of contents for this webinar, the purpose of the program, the eligibility, the submission of applications, the eligibility requirements, instructions, selection criteria, the priorities including related to evidence, allowable and unallowable activities, the grants.gov instructions, and at the end for all your questions. The purpose of the AANAPISI program is to provide grants and related assistance to AANAPISIs to enable such institutions to improve and expand their capacity to serve Asian Americans and Native American Pacific Islanders and low-income individuals. In order to be eligible for the program, please visit http://opeweb.ed.gov/Title III and 5 and enter your institution's 8-digit OPE ID into the database. And then you will get a letter showing that you are eligible for that you're eligible. If you are not eligible, you should have submitted a waiver, and the waiver deadline was January 4th, 2016. And at the time of the application, an institution must have an enrollment of undergraduate students that is at least 10% AAPI. Submission of applications. The applications must be submitted electronically using grants.gov unless you qualify for an exemption. Requirements for obtaining an exemption or exceptions are discussed in the closing date notice. The closing date for receipt of applications are April 22nd, 2016. Eligibility requirements. To be eligible for the AANAPISI grant, an institution must, among other requirements, be accredited or pre-accredited by a nationally recognized accrediting agency or association. 10% Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander student enrollment. A high enrollment of needy students, and have core expenditures per FTE equivalent undergraduate student that are low in comparison with the average core expenditures of similar institutions. It's very important you follow the instructions, read all the instructions a number of times. You're being evaluated clearly by what you write in your application, not the great idea that you may have. The page format is 8 by 5 by 11, 8.5 by 11 with 1-inch margins, double space, all text in the application, narrative except headings, footnotes, quotation, references, or captions, all text and charts could be single space. The abstract can be single space, and the font should be no larger than 12 and no smaller than 10. And also make sure you use fonts Times New Roman, Carrier, Carrier New, or Arial. The program narrative, the page limits. The program narrative is 50 pages. The absolute priority is 3 pages. The competitive preference priority is 3 pages. And the invitation priority is 2 pages for a total of 58 pages. Exceeding the page limit will disqualify your application. What's included in the page count? Only the program narrative is included in the page count. If you include any attachments or appendices, these will be counted as part of the program narrative. What's not included in the page count? The application for federal assistance and supplemental information form SF-424, the budget information, which is the Ed 524, the assurances and certifications, the table of contents, the 1-page abstract, resumes, bibliographies, letters of support, and your 2 studies. We will reject your application if you exceed the page limit. The selection criteria determine the order of the application. Your application is not a scavenger hunt where the readers have to search for information. Place your information in the proper place and do not depend on readers to find it elsewhere. The reader evaluations are not based on writing style. Readers are not looking for a great literary work. However, it is essential that you write in a clear and understandable fashion and do check grammar and spelling. Read and follow the guidelines. Address everything that is called for. Leave out extraneous material. Write clearly. Beware of jargon and buzzwords. Use facts and statistics to prove your case. Make sure that there are current facts and statistics. Be sure that the facts and figures you use in one section of your application are consistent with those used elsewhere. The selection criteria has 7 evaluation areas. You have the need for the project, which is 25 points. The quality of the project design is 20 points. The quality of the project services is 10 points. The quality of the project personnel is 10 points. The adequacy of resources is 5 points. The quality of the management plan is 15 points. And the quality of the project evaluation is 15 points, for a total of 100 points. The need for the project. This is where the magnitude of the needs for the services provided, activities carried out by proposed project. The extent to which the proposed project will focus on serving or otherwise addressing the needs of the disadvantaged individuals, and also the extent to which specific gaps or weaknesses in services, infrastructure, or opportunities have been identified and will be addressed by the proposed project, including nature and magnitude of the weaknesses. And what the reviewers are looking for in this area is they're looking for that you establish the needs of the targeted groups, and also that you provide current statistical data that support the need for the project, and also that you adequately tell how the proposed project intends to address the needs of the targeted groups and identify the gaps or weaknesses in services, infrastructure, or opportunities of the targeted group. The next section is the quality of the project design. This is the extent to which the goals and objectives and outcomes to be achieved by the proposed project is clearly specified and measurable, and also to the extent to which the design of the proposed project is appropriate to and will successfully address the needs of the targeted population or other identified needs. So what the reviewers are looking for in this section, that you provide a good overall framework for the services that you are being provided, that you clearly state the goals, objectives, and activities with measurable outcomes that are able to deliver the services to the targeted group, and that you link the project design to proven research. The quality of the project services is 10 points. So the extent to which the services provided by the proposed project are appropriate to the needs to the intended recipient or beneficiaries of those services, and also the extent to which the services to be provided by the proposed project reflect up-to-date knowledge from research and effective practice. So what the reviewers be looking for in this section, a good development of specific programs that provide support that would support the targeted group, and also programs that effectively integrate the targeted group in the overall system of meeting the needs of the targeted group, and research that supports the various programs linking to effectively serve the targeted students. Quality of the project personnel. It's the qualifications including relevant training and experience of the project director or principal investigator, also the qualifications including relevant training and experience of key personnel. What the reviewers will be looking for in regard to rating your application are the qualifications and experiences of the personnel and time and effort for key personnel, and also the training the personnel has in dealing with the targeted group in culturally competent manner, and also state the qualifications of future personnel. When you're writing your grant, a lot of times many applicants do not have their personnel on board, but you make sure in your application you state what are the qualifications that you are looking for to hire someone in that position. The adequacy of resources. This is the extent to which the budget is adequate to support the proposed project, and also the extent to which the costs are reasonable in relation to the objectives, design, and the potential significance of the proposed project. So in this section, just a breakdown of the costs per line item showing that the costs are reasonable. In your budget narrative section, you will have a fuller opportunity to break down each budget line in your application. The adequacy of resources is really just a summary of your budget narrative. The quality of the management plan. This is the adequacy of the management plan to achieve the objectives of the proposed project on time and within budget, including clearly defined responsibilities, timelines, and milestones for accomplishing the project task. And also the adequacy of procedures for ensuring feedback and continuous improvement in the operation of the proposed project, and also the adequacy of mechanisms for ensuring high-quality products and services for the proposed project. So in this section, the reviewers are looking for a clear management framework with timelines. Within the framework, where is the project in the institutional structure? Do the project director have access to the executive branch of your institution? And within the timelines, the milestones of when items will be completed and clearly stated. So it's very important you please keep that in mind when you complete the quality of the management plan in your application. The quality of the evaluation, project evaluation. This is the extent to which the methods of evaluations are thorough, feasible, and appropriate to the goals, objectives, and outcomes of a proposed project, and the extent to which the methods of evaluation will provide performance feedback and permit periodic assessment of progress toward achieving intended outcomes, and the extent to which methods of evaluation include the use of objective performance measures that are clearly related to the intended outcomes of the project and will produce quantitative and qualitative data to the extent possible. So in this section, reviewers are looking for a defined evaluation plan that measures progress toward all objectives noted in the application, and also what types of data, quantitative and qualitative, that will be collected, the frequency of data collection, and clearly illustrates how the data collection will be used to determine where the objectives have been met. Let's go back real quick. And also the reviewers are looking for in your data collection includes performance measures that are related to the intended outcomes of the project is adequate, and also a comprehensive plan that provides performance feedback that use periodic assessments to determine the progress toward achieving the intended outcomes. So please keep all that in mind when you're doing your evaluation plan. There is an absolute priority in this application. You must address this absolute priority or your application will be disqualified. You have 3 pages to address this, and the absolute priority of supporting high-need students. Department identify high-need students as high-need students, students with disabilities, English learners, disconnected youth or migrant youth, low-skill or low-skill adults. So projects that are designed to improve the academic outcomes and learning environments are both, that's what you need to address when you answer your absolute priority. Competitive preference priorities. You have 2 competitive preference priorities. Competitive preference 1 is for 1 additional point, application supported by evidence of effectiveness that meets the conditions set out in the definition of evidence of promise. Competitive preference 2 would be 3 additional points, application supported by evidence of effectiveness that meets the conditions set out in the definition of modern evidence of effectiveness. In this part of the webinar, I'll turn over to Jonathan Jacobson, and he would take you further with the evidence portion.
Thank you, Pearson. In this portion of the presentation, I plan to describe the definitions of evidence that are relevant for this particular grant competition. As Pearson said, my name is Jonathan Jacobson. I'm with the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance with the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research, statistics, and evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Education. So to give you a brief overview of this portion of the presentation, I first plan to discuss why we should care about evidence. I'll then provide a brief introduction to the What Works Clearinghouse, which is an initiative of the Institute of Education Sciences. I'll describe strong theory and logic models and how they relate to evidence. I'll describe the definition of evidence of promise, which is relevant for this competition. I'll also describe the definition of evidence of effectiveness. So first, why should we care about evidence? I'd like to share a quotation from the poet Walt Whitman. He said, "I like the scientific spirit, the holding off, the being sure but not too sure, the willingness to surrender ideas when the evidence is against them. This is ultimately fine. It always keeps the way beyond open, always gives life, thought, affection, the whole man, a chance to try over again after a mistake, after a wrong guess." Also, as I'm sure you're aware, the U.S. Department of Education and its grantees are placing an increasing emphasis on using evidence and building empirical evidence of the effectiveness of education interventions, which can be programs, policies, or practices. So let's consider, where do you go to find evidence to support education decisions? First, you might rely on yourself. You might rely on your own knowledge and experience that might be relevant for the decision you face. Second, you might turn to colleagues, peers, program administrators who can offer valuable insights on what works. Third, you might turn to professional associations that might have gathered evidence and summarized it for your benefit. Fourth, you might turn to academic researchers or researchers with non-academic organizations who can offer insights on evidence. And fifth, you might go online. You might search through news stories, blogs, journal articles, although some of those might be behind paywalls. The What Works Clearinghouse is an initiative of the Institute of Education Sciences here at the Department of Education. And what the What Works Clearinghouse does is reviews, rates, and summarizes original studies of the effectiveness of education interventions. So there are many types of education research, and these different types of research can be valuable for different purposes. The What Works Clearinghouse focuses on original studies of the effectiveness of education interventions, which are only a portion of all the education research studies that are out there. The WWC does not rate qualitative studies, descriptive studies, or studies that reanalyze or synthesize others' data. When reviewing studies, the What Works Clearinghouse applies evidence standards that were developed by panels of national experts for different types of effectiveness studies. These standards for studies focus on the internal validity of estimates, which means whether an estimated impact is a valid estimate or whether it's likely to be biased. When applied to individual studies by teams of certified reviewers, the What Works Clearinghouse gives a study one of three possible ratings. The highest rating is meets What Works Clearinghouse standards without reservations. The next highest rating is meets What Works Clearinghouse standards with reservations. And the third rating is does not meet What Works Clearinghouse standards. I'd like to make a few remarks about What Works Clearinghouse evidence ratings. First, a rating that a study meets standards is applied to the findings of that study, not the intervention itself. Second, the study as a whole receives the rating of the highest rated finding reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse, which may be different from the finding that is relevant for your project. Third, a high study rating is not the What Works Clearinghouse's endorsement of an intervention or a determination that either an intervention or a finding is relevant for your project. The What Works Clearinghouse does not endorse interventions, and the determination of relevance of the intervention or of the finding is one ultimately that you need to make. Fourth, the sign, size or magnitude, and statistical significance of the estimated effect are reported by the What Works Clearinghouse, but they do not affect the WWC study rating. So a study rating of meets What Works Clearinghouse standards does not mean that the intervention is effective. Another way of thinking of this is the clearinghouse is rating the quality of the study, not rating the quality of the intervention. A high-quality study should describe something about the quality of the intervention, but that's not what the clearinghouse is rating. The clearinghouse is rating the quality of the study. Finally, study ratings can change when What Works Clearinghouse standards are updated. So some study ratings listed in the What Works Clearinghouse Reviewed Studies database that were obtained a number of years ago may be out of date. I'm going to turn now to talk not about evidence, but about strong theory and logic models, which are foundational for building evidence. The definitions I'm going to share with you are relevant for the competition. They're not from the What Works Clearinghouse, but from the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, sometimes known by the acronym EDGAR. So strong theory is distinct from evidence. It means a rationale for the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice that includes a logic model. Now, what is a logic model? A logic model, which is also known as a theory of action, means a well-specified conceptual framework that identifies key components of the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice, and describes the relationship among those key components and outcomes. So the components of a logic model, which are discussed in greater detail at the report listed on the screen now, produced by the Regional Educational Laboratories. The components, first of all, are resources, which are the materials to implement the program, followed by activities, which are the steps for the program to be implemented. These activities then produce outputs, which are the products of the program, the initial results of what the program is doing. And finally, fourth component are impacts on outcomes. These are changes in program participants' knowledge, beliefs, or behavior resulting from the program's work. So on the screen now is a logic model for the What Works Clearinghouse that gives an example of how these different components of a logic model play out in what the clearinghouse does. The clearinghouse starts with resources that consist of researchers' studies. These studies are often entered into a database that the department maintains called the Education Resources Information Center. It's available online, lists a wide range of education studies. These studies then are submitted for review by the clearinghouse, which is the primary activity of the clearinghouse, to review studies, to review the evidence in studies, applying evidence standards to specific studies through the work of certified reviewers. This evidence review then results in an output, which is often a publication available for free on the What Works Clearinghouse website. These publications are in turn intended to have an impact on practitioners and ultimately on students. They're intended to inform practitioners' decisions, so those decisions are informed by evidence, with the goal that practitioners will then make decisions that in the long run improve student outcomes. Now, the information here doesn't just flow in one direction. It's entirely possible that practitioners will have areas of interest to them, and they'll make suggestions to the clearinghouse on topics for future publications, future reviews of evidence. It's also the case that those publications will be read by researchers and can inform future research. So returning to EDGAR, let's consider the department's definitions of evidence as they pertain to grant competitions. Evidence goes beyond theory by having an empirical basis that a program works. The department's regulations distinguish three levels of evidence: evidence of promise, moderate evidence of effectiveness, and strong evidence of effectiveness. The two definitions that are relevant for this competition are evidence of promise and moderate evidence of effectiveness, so I'll discuss those in depth. First, evidence of promise. Now, if you look for evidence of promise on the What Works Clearinghouse website, you won't find it because it's not defined by the clearinghouse, but it is defined by the department through the regulations. Evidence of promise is empirical evidence to support the theoretical linkages between at least one critical component and at least one relevant outcome presented in the logic model for the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice. And a really important point here is evidence of promise is based on a logic model. A logic model identifies a critical component and it identifies a relevant outcome. The relationship between those two can then be studied empirically. So evidence of promise needs to include one study that falls into one of three possible categories. First is a correlational study with statistical controls for selection bias. I'll explain that in a moment. Second possibility is a quasi-experimental design, or QED, that meets What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards with reservations. And the third possibility is a randomized controlled trial that meets the What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards with or without reservations. So let me describe each of those types of studies in a little more detail. But before I do, I just want to note there's an additional requirement for evidence of promise, and this regards the effect estimated by the study, reported by the study. To meet the evidence of promise definition, the study must have found a statistically significant or substantively important favorable association between at least one critical component and one relevant outcome presented in the logic model for the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice. So a statistically significant finding is one that if it were detected by chance would be unlikely to be detected. And a substantively important one is a finding of a difference of 0.25 standard deviations or larger. Often studies will find statistically significant findings when they have large samples, but studies, even if they don't include large samples, can find substantively important findings or associations between the critical component of the program and the relevant outcome. Now, to meet the definition of a correlational study for evidence of promise, the study should look at the association between receipt of an intervention and an outcome of interest. An intervention here is defined very broadly. It can be a process, product, strategy, practice, program, or policy. Correlational study meeting the evidence of promise definition also needs to include statistical controls for selection bias. These are the methods used by study authors to attempt to compare subjects similar except for the receipt of the intervention. What's selection bias? Selection bias is an error in choosing the individuals or groups to take part in a study. Ideally, the subjects in a study should be very similar to one another. If there are important differences, the results of the study may not be valid. So I'd like to give an example of why impact studies might need comparison groups. Let's suppose for the moment that you were tracking outcomes over time and you had data for 3 years for your program. You had data from schools or on students receiving an intervention. And the data over time showed improvement. And the first year was a baseline year before the program was implemented, and then the second and third years were the first and second years of program implementation. Someone might look at those years and conclude that the program was having a positive impact because the outcomes improved over time for the program. But this is the risk of doing a study without a comparison group. If you had an equivalent comparison group that was the same as the group receiving the intervention in the baseline year, and then tracked outcomes for them as well, you might actually see that students in the comparison group could be doing better than those in the program group. And so a study using a comparison group would conclude that this particular intervention did not have a positive impact on students because the comparison group students were doing even better. It doesn't mean the program wasn't helping. It means that the alternative to the program was helping an equivalent group of students even more. So ideally, we would like to form an equivalent comparison group to use in a study of a program's effectiveness or of an intervention's effectiveness. What are the ways that researchers can do that? What should we be looking for in studies of the effectiveness of interventions? Well, a good way to form a comparison group is to select what's known as a match comparison group that's similar to the intervention group in terms of relevant measured characteristics. This is known as a quasi-experimental design, or QED, and at best, it can meet What Works Clearinghouse group design standards with reservations. The reason there are reservations is we only know that this group is similar to the intervention group by measured characteristics. There might be unmeasured characteristics that are different for the intervention group and the comparison group. An even better way to form a comparison group is if a study is able to use a rating variable, which could be a measure of need or merit, to actually assign higher rated subjects to the intervention and then use the lower rated subjects as a comparison group. The study authors could then estimate effects of the intervention for students on the margins of eligibility for the intervention. This is known as a regression discontinuity design, or RDD. This sort of study can at best meet What Works Clearinghouse RDD standards without reservations. The Clearinghouse has a separate set of standards for regression discontinuity designs because of the unique features of this sort of design. But the best way to form a comparison group is not to use a quasi-experimental design or a regression discontinuity design, but if possible to conduct a randomized controlled trial, or RCT, in which a lottery is used to assign some eligible subjects to the intervention and other eligible subjects to a control group. This sort of study, if both well-designed and well-implemented, can at best meet What Works Clearinghouse group design standards without reservations. Randomized controlled trials are not always feasible, but when they are, they provide the highest evidence of effectiveness for an education intervention. This table on your screen now shows the sorts of studies that can provide evidence of promise. The columns of the table show the three possible What Works Clearinghouse ratings of a study. The highest rating is on the left, meets standards without reservations. The middle rating is meets standards with reservations, and then the lowest rating, which is on the right, does not meet WWC standards. The rows of the table show three types of studies corresponding with the three sorts of ways of forming comparison groups that I just described. First row is for randomized controlled trials. So a randomized controlled trial, if well-designed and well-implemented, can meet What Works Clearinghouse standards without reservations. There also are RCTs that have problems, so sometimes they meet with reservations, and sometimes they don't meet What Works Clearinghouse standards at all. However, even if they don't meet clearinghouse standards, they might provide evidence of promise. Likewise, for regression discontinuity studies, they can meet clearinghouse RDD standards with or without reservations. They also might not meet those standards. Quasi-experimental designs, such as match comparison group studies, cannot meet the highest What Works Clearinghouse evidence rating, but they can meet What Works Clearinghouse standards with reservations, and sometimes they don't meet What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards. What's important is for evidence of promise, all of these sorts of studies can provide evidence of promise if they study an intervention and they have a comparison group. Suppose you're looking for studies that are relevant for the project you're proposing. There are several resources that you can turn to find studies that are relevant for what you're proposing to do. These are available at the website for the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance. The first I've already mentioned, ERIC, the Education Resources Information Center. It contains a searchable digital database of studies, effectiveness studies, as well as descriptive studies. So it's a very broad set of studies that you can search through to see which ones might be relevant for your project. You can also seek assistance and studies through the database of the National Library of Education, which is also accessible through the IES website. And finally, the What Works Clearinghouse has a reviewed studies database listing studies reviewed by the WWC in the past, describing the What Works Clearinghouse rating of the study, the reason for the review, including links to any relevant WWC publications describing that review in greater detail. The caution I would have in looking through studies here is, as I said before, some of these reviews might have occurred some time ago, so if proposed in your application, it might be necessary for a study to be reviewed again under current What Works Clearinghouse standards. I'll now summarize what a study needs to include to provide evidence of promise. First, the study needs to investigate the effect of the intervention, or a key component of a project, on a relevant outcome. The intervention or the key component, the relevant outcome, should be defined in the logic model for the program. Second, the study should use a treatment group and a comparison group to associate differences in outcomes with the intervention while including statistical controls for selection bias. There should be an effort on the part of the study to compare apples to apples rather than apples to oranges to understand the effect of the intervention. Third, the study would need to show a statistically significant or a substantively important effect on a key outcome in order for the study to provide evidence of promise. Now, let's contrast those requirements for evidence of promise with the higher evidence rating that's relevant for this competition, moderate evidence of effectiveness. This is also defined by the Department of Education regulations. For moderate evidence of effectiveness, the study needs to meet What Works Clearinghouse standards with or without reservations. So the study either has to be a randomized controlled trial that meets WWC standards without reservations, or QED, or a randomized controlled trial that meets WWC standards with reservations. And if it meets with reservations, the study needs to include a large multi-site sample. That's defined in the grant notice, exactly what a large multi-site sample is, but there's that additional requirement if the study only meets with reservations. The study needs to have overlap with the population or settings proposed for the intervention in your project in order to provide moderate evidence of effectiveness. And third, the study needs to show a statistically significant favorable impact with no statistically significant and overriding unfavorable impacts in that study or other studies of the intervention reviewed and reported by the What Works Clearinghouse. So here it's not enough for the magnitude of the impact to be large. It has to be detected in a statistically significant way by the study in order to provide moderate evidence of effectiveness. Now, realize you might have some questions about the evidence portion of this presentation. We ask that you save those for the end when we'll try to respond to them. I'll now turn the presentation back to Pearson.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I want to stress before we move away from the evidence part, IES is only rating your study. They're not rating the relevance of what you propose in your the activity proposing in the competitive preference priority part. So in the 3 pages, your activity you're proposing must be relevant to the study that you submit. So the reviewers will be reviewing the relevance of your proposal. So they will be looking to see is the outcome the study found to have statistically significant favorable impact on the relevant outcome. And also, does the study include a sample that overlaps with the population or settings proposed to receive the process, product, strategy, or practice? And also, does the study examine the effectiveness of the process, product, strategy, or practice being proposed? So it's very important that you make sure that the activity proposing is relevant to the study you're submitting. Because if you submit a study that's not relevant to the activity you're proposing, your application will not be sent to IES and you will be denied the extra points. So make sure whatever you propose is relevant to the study that you're submitting with your application. So also, we have an invitation priority. There's no points attached to it, so you're not rated on it one way or the other if you choose not to answer it. but if you choose to answer the invitational priority, it's projects that support activities that strengthen Native American Pacific Islander language preservation and revitalization. The allowable activities for this project, you can purchase, rental, or at least scientific laboratory equipment for educational purposes. Also, you allow construction, maintenance, renovation, and improvement in classrooms, libraries, laboratories, and other institutional facilities, including integration of computer technology into institutional facilities to create smart buildings. Also, you can support faculty exchange, faculty development, faculty fellowships to assist in attaining advanced degrees in the faculty's field of study. Also, you're allowed to develop an improvement of academic programs. You can purchase library books, microfilms, education materials, and telecommunication program materials. You can also do tutoring, counseling, and student service programs designed to improve academic success. You allow funds management, administrative management, acquisition of equipment to use in strengthening funds management. You can also use joint facilities such as laboratories and libraries. Also, you're allowed to improve or establish and development office to strengthen or improve contributions from alumni in the private sector. You can establish or improve an endowment fund, and also you can create and improve facilities for internet or other distant learning, academic instruction capabilities, including purchase of rental or telecommunications technology equipment services. A lot of institutions are instituting distant learning, so that will apply here. The unallowable activities, you're not allowed to carry out any of the following activities. Any activities not approved in an approved application, activities that are inconsistent with any state plan for higher education, activities or services related to sectarian instruction or religious worship, no recruitment unless recruitment hiring is no recruitment costs unless it is for hiring positions on the grant. So any recruitment costs such as advertisement, literature, or college affairs for student recruitment is unallowable. Development or improvement in non-degree or non-credit courses other than basic skill courses, purchase of standard office equipment not related to the grant, payment for any portion of the salary of the president, vice president, or equivalent officer who holds college-wide administrative authority and responsibility at an institution to fill a position under the grant. And that also relates to their travel also. And also any activities that are operational in nature rather than developmental in nature are unallowable. Costs of organized fundraising, including financial campaigns, endowment drives, solicitation of gifts, and bequests, and similar expenses to raise capital or attain contributions. Instruction in the institution's standard courses, costs of health and fitness programs, transportation and daycare services, student activities such as entertainment, cultural or social enrichment programs, publication or social clubs or associations are unallowable, and also allowing contracts to anyone that participated in the development of the grant. For example, if you have an external evaluator that wrote up the evaluation piece of your application, that person cannot be awarded a contract on the grant. And also, indirect costs are unallowable on this grant. You will be submitting your application on grants.gov. These are submission procedure and tips for applicants, so make sure you register early at SAM. That's at sam.gov. We strongly recommend you do not wait until the last day to submit your application. Grants.gov put a date/time stamp on your application and then process it after it's fully uploaded. Verification submission is okay. You need to verify that Grants.gov receive your application submission on time and that it was validated successfully. To see the date/time your application was received, log into Grants.gov, click on Track My Application link. If you have any problems submitting your application before the closing date, contact Grants.gov at the customer service number stated here, 1-800-518-6686. 4726, or at the website here, which is grants.gov/web/grants/about contracts/us.html. This is how the application looks in grants.gov. You see the opportunity title, the offering agency, CFD number, and on. So these are the mandatory forms for the application. You see the application for further assistance as 424, U.S. Department but information for non-construction programs, which is the budget form, the assurance for non-construction programs. You have the grants.gov lobbying form, disclosure of lobbying activities, the AD GAPA form, the SF 424 supplement, the AD abstract, the project narrative form, budget narrative form, which explains the 524 form, and the other attachment form. So it's mandatory that you submit a GAPA statement, and basically in this statement you are saying that how your activities you're proposing do not impede accessible access. So how is it accessible? So it's a short paragraph describing what steps you're taking to overcome any barriers that do not limit access to the activities you're proposing. But this is a mandatory document. It's a short paragraph that you need to attach here under the GAPA statement. So just a short GAPA statement saying how your programs are accessible. It doesn't impede accessibility. The project narrative form, this is where you're going to upload your 50-page project narrative on the Add Mandatory Project Narrative file. So you upload that here. The optional project narrative file is where you're going to upload your three-page absolute priority here. So here, the 50-page project narrative and the Add Mandatory Project file, and the three-page absolute priority under Add Optional Project Narrative file. The budget narrative file. This is the 524 form you're going to fill out. In here on the Add Mandatory Budget Narrative, this is where you're going to add your budget narrative. This is where you're going to explain the budget categories for the personnel, your friends, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, or other. You're going to describe that here, and you're going to add your Add Budget Narrative description of your budget categories here. So in this section, Add Mandatory Budget Narrative is a description of the budget categories of your proposal. The Add Mandatory Attachment. The program profile page, you will see the program profile page in the application that's attached in grants.gov. You are going to duplicate this program profile page, and you're going to attach it here under Add Mandatory Other Attachment. The program profile page is a mandatory attachment that goes in your application. This page is very important. This page that you're going to answer key financial information from your institution. So it's very, very important you make sure if you have to contact the financial office at your institution that you have the correct information here, because we use the information from your program profile page if there's a tie. We use this information to determine the tiebreaker. So it's very important that this information is up to date and that it's completed in your application. Without including the program profile page and attaching it here and Add Mandatory Attachment will disqualify your application. Now, within here you see the Add Optional Other Attachment. Here you want to attach the studies, so your competitive preference priority, any resumes, letters of support, bibliographies, anything that's allowable attachments that was discussed in this presentation you will attach all the documents here and add optional other attachments. So 5 key reasons your application will be disqualified. Going over the allotted page limits, asking for more than $350,000 per year. That's the limit you can ask for in this grant for 5 years, $350,000 per year for 5 years. Not responding to the absolute priority, not including a GEPA statement, which stating how the projects you're proposing are accessible, and not including the program profile page, which can be found in the application that's in grants.gov. A live version of this presentation, including a recorded version with the files, can be found on the, we will update it on this page here, www.ed.gov/programs/AANAPI/applicant.html #tips. So you would find this recorded version of this presentation here. Now we'll open up the line for questions, and here's my contact information for future reference. If you have questions that you prefer that send properly or call or email, my information is here. So now we open up the webinar for questions.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. And if you would like to ask a question, you may press star followed by the number 1. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Your name will be needed to introduce your question. To cancel, please press star, then the number 2. Let's wait for a moment for the first question. At this time, speakers, I'm not seeing any questions in queue. Once again, to ask a question, please press star followed by the number 1. At this time, there are no questions in queue. Speakers, you may continue.
So there's no questions?
And right now we have 2 that just got in. Let me check the details here. Our first question is from the line of Michelle. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you. My question is about the What Works Clearinghouse, and it may be me user error, but I've been working on trying to find studies that are for higher ed around student success with the Asian American Pacific Islander population, and I have found nothing. Am I using it wrong, or do I have to go someplace else?
It's entirely possible that you're using it correctly. I can't speak for sure because I don't know which studies you're looking at. What I would recommend doing is not relying just on the Reviewed Studies database in the clearinghouse, but relying on some of the other resources. ERIC is a very broad database for searching studies. It may be that the study in question, when it was reviewed by the clearinghouse, the focus wasn't on the findings that are relevant for the populations of interest to you, or it may be that the studies reviewed by the clearinghouse that you were looking at didn't look at that population. I would recommend broadening the search to not just include what's been reviewed by the clearinghouse. There certainly are plans to review studies that are submitted that are not currently in the clearinghouse database. So if an application was looking for evidence that would meet the moderate evidence of effectiveness, and there was a study that was included in the application, and it hadn't yet been reviewed by the clearinghouse, that study would be reviewed for that purpose, and then in the future that information would be in the study database for the clearinghouse. But it might be that you need to broaden the search to figure out what to include. It doesn't necessarily mean you're using the clearinghouse incorrectly. However, if you're not sure you're using the clearinghouse correctly, there's a help desk on the clearinghouse website. You can ask questions there, You can also ask for help on the ERIC website or from the National Library of Education to make sure that you are properly using the search tools there. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Our next question is from the line of Ms. Salina Mutiga. Ma'am, your line is open.
Hi, yes, I had a question. So I think I missed a little bit of the beginning of the webinar, but we were wondering, so we know we have to include Native American and Asian Pacific Islanders, but you also mentioned low income. Do they have to be both, or can we also include students and Asian Americans and Native Americans? So can you just clarify that a little bit?
You can include both.
Okay.
At this time, there are no additional questions in queue. Once again, to ask a question, please press star followed by the number 1. At this time, speakers, I'm not seeing any additional questions. You may continue.
Well, if there's no additional questions, like I said, if you have any specific questions that you like future follow-up, you can send me an email at pearson.owens@ed or call me at 202-453-7997.
Speakers, we do have one new question here, and that is from the line of Jonathan. Sir, the line is open.
Hi, I had a quick question about partnering with a community organization or almost a sub-grantee. Is that allowable for a certain portion of the grant, and if so, what are the rules that govern it?
For the Part F program, there's not a community component working with community-based organizations like in the Part A. So under the allowable activities, that isn't stated that you can do that. So any partnerships, I guess how you frame it, but a direct answer to your question, there's no allowable activities for the Part F AANAPISI grant allow working with community-based organization, as in the Part A, definitely have that component in it. So that's the answer on that question.
Okay, thank you.
Once again, participants, to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1. Okay, speakers, no questions in queue. Please proceed.
Okay. I just want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. And like I said, any other additional questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.